In 1987, director Adrian Lyne made a movie based on a short film by James Dearden about a New York City lawyer called Dan who has an extramarital affair with a mysterious, sexy blonde called Alex. After a weekend of illicit, hot, steamy sex, Dan tries to shun and ignore Alex, hoping she'll go away. But Alex will not be ignored.
What am I supposed to do? You won't answer my calls, you change your number. I mean, I'm not going to be ignored, Dan.
The movie, Fatal Attraction, was an intoxicating mix of softcore eroticism and operatic slasher horror that proved to be a winning formula at the box office. From a $14 million budget, the movie went on to gross over $300 million and received 6 Academy Award nominations.
Daddy! What?
In its wake came a spate of high-end, glossy thrillers through the late 80s and early 90s. Films that took on the tropes of 80s slasher horror, but they put respectable stars front and centre. The films were often set within the home and focused on female characters in the tradition of the classic women's pictures of the 1940s.
Go ahead, hit me. If you can't fuck me, why don't you just hit me?
So sad. You know that, Alex. Lonely and very sad.
Don't you ever pity me, smug bastard.
But these women were often the villains. They were dangerous, unhinged, and they shared more in common with the antagonists of the Grande Dame Guignol pictures of the 1960s.
I'm gonna kill you, you lying cocksucker!
In 1990, Rob Reiner adapted one of Stephen King's most terrifying novels, Misery, about a writer being abducted and tortured by a deranged fan called Annie Wilkes.
I'm your #1 fan.
Actress Kathy Bates channeled Betty Davis and other hagsploitation stars for her performance as Annie, and it went on to win her an Oscar for Best Actress. While both these films were more commonly labelled thrillers rather than horrors, as they were far too respectable to be considered horrors, both feature some of the most frightening moments in modern cinema, and both gave us 2 of the most iconic female horror villains of all time in Alex Forrest and Annie Wilkes.
You did it! You did it! You murdered my misery!
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Adrian Lyne's Fatal Attraction and Rob Reiner's Misery.
He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car!
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 15. In this episode, as that intro suggested, we've got 2 cracking films to talk about: Fatal Attraction from 1987 and Misery from 1990. Both of these discussions will, of course, be spoilerific. If you haven't seen these films, what on earth are you doing? Go and give them a watch immediately before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these 2 incredible movies, a longtime friend of this podcast, very good friend of mine. She is one of my Fresh Blood co-hosts, and she was last here on the main podcast in our vampire series to discuss From Dusk Till Dawn and interview with the vampire with me, because she loves anything made in the early 90s. It's Becky Darke. Hello, Becky.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm really excited.
Yeah. Two bangers to discuss, right?
Absolute bangers. Yeah, I'm really excited to be back.
Oh my God, it's so good to have you back. I'm going to hurtle straight into it because, you know, me and you always have lots to say. So we might as well kick straight off. First of all, let me ask you about this subgenre, Becky. What are your thoughts on home invasion movies? Like, do you gravitate towards home invasion films? Do you kind of stay away from them? What are your thoughts?
I'd say historically I didn't gravitate towards them. It's been a bit of a later addition to my horror canon, this subgenre. I tended to used to avoid all the stuff that people described as like extreme. So
yes.
I know that stuff like I don't know, The Strangers and Funny Games and stuff isn't what some people would call extreme, but for me that used to be what I called extreme, and people would sort of, you know, talk about them as like these really grueling kind of harrowing movies, and so I gave them a very wide berth while I was kind of luxuriating in the world of witchcraft and the occult and, you know, that kind of thing. But I've come to them a bit later, and I've got to admit, I kind of like it. I've become this freaky little sort of apologist for these kinds of movies. And now anything that really kind of pushes my boundaries, and, you know, let's face it, with home invasion, these are boundaries that we all like to put up around ourselves, keeping ourselves safe within our little homes. You know, this is our safe space. This is our own kind of domain where we feel very comfortable. We feel, probably for a lot of people, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, we feel most ourselves and most comfortable and most safe. You know, home invasion is that thing that knocks at the door of that, or doesn't even knock a lot of the time, just fucking lets itself in. And that's pretty fucking scary.
What do you find more stressful and anxiety inducing? The idea of loads and loads of people descending upon your house, and not even in a dangerous way, just like generally having lots of people in your house, or being in someone else's house and not wanting to be there?
Definitely the latter. I love to throw a house party. I throw quite legendary birthday parties every year where I invite far too many people, probably, certainly as far as my neighbours are concerned. And I love people coming over. I love playing hostess. I find it much more difficult when I'm round somebody else's house and I'm like, when is it polite for me to
fuck off?
to fuck off back to my house where all of my, you know, where all of my stuff is, and I can kind of kick my shoes off.
Yes.
Yeah, so I would say definitely come on over, but don't necessarily invite me round.
I love that. And there are different types of home invasion, of course, you know, which is what we're going to talk about later. These movies aren't traditional home invasions, but they have these invasion elements to them, right? But I just wondered, you know, what about in real life? Have you ever experienced anything of a kind of home invasion in your sort of personal space? So
not like a break-in where a stranger has kind of come into my home and, you know, especially like not when I've been there or, you know, you come back and somebody's been in your space. I mean, I cannot, like, I can imagine it and I can't think about how I would react to that. I think I would probably have to move. Like that would fuck me up so much. Yeah. But when I was at university, I was living with a guy who is now known in common parlance as Bad Boyfriend, who went through a period after we broke up of letting himself into my room at uni and like fucking with my stuff. So this was like, for example, this was the age of mini discs. Don't know if you remember them.
Loved mini discs.
Loved a mini disc. I was obsessed. I had, you know, used to get those beautiful rainbow coloured ones. Yeah. And I would spend hours sort of labelling the tracks and, you know, it was all very illegal, but very good fun at the time. It's probably why they don't really exist anymore.
That's so true, yeah.
And so I'd go out and he was a fucking nightmare. And he used to do things like let himself into my room and he'd like pull back the covers on the mini disc and like take a compass or a knife and like scratch all my mini discs.
Fucking hell.
Or stuff like oh my God. I made a load of like vodka jellies for one of my friends and I like came down the next morning and this guy had like spat in like all of the vodka jelly and stuff. Like, so I've sort of had it from, it's a bit like when a stranger calls, like the caller's within the house. Do you know what I mean? Like I lived with this douchebag and, but you know, again, when you're living in student housing, that your room, when you're flat sharing or you're in student housing or whatever, that is supposed to be your space. And I not only felt very violated by him sort of letting himself into my room and doing like horrible things to my personal belongings.
Yeah.
But then I kind of couldn't then escape it when I came home. Like he was in the house.
Jesus.
It was fucked up.
It's horrible. And that is a really, really frightening kind of flip side to the traditional home invasion. And that's something we've been looking at in films, going all the way back to films like Gaslight, right? This idea that the horror or the monster is within your house from the beginning, right? And that is in itself going all the way through to like Sleeping with the Enemy next week we're doing, and Fear, and these sorts of movies, like these kind of like the person that you're with, you're supposed to be your most trusted, in theory, person, like if it's your partner or whatever, and they're actually the dangerous ones. That's another kind of flip side of home invasion in that regard, you know?
And what's so weird about it was at the time, like obviously it was horrible.
Yeah.
But I think for me personally, like when I was in it, it was almost just like damage control.
Yeah.
So I was just trying to like deal with it in the moment. Also, I had like, it was, you talk about gaslight, and I was horribly, horribly gaslit by this person. And so, I always thought that I was doing something to cause his behavior. And so in the moment, it was just like trying to deal with it and like limit the kind of the implications of it, certainly for like our other housemates and like stuff like that. I look back at it now, sort of 20 years on, and I'm like, I should have called the fucking police. Like this should have been, it was really abusive and like damaging. But it's fine. I'm here, and hopefully he's living a miserable life somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
We can only hope.
I hope that karma's come and bit him on the arse.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. Well, before we get into these movies, I want to talk to you about this kind of like really interesting era that I'm going to be spending like a couple of weeks in. This kind of late 80s, early 90s sort of like domestic set sort of thriller horrors. Like next week we're going to be doing Sleeping with the Enemy and Fear. The week after we're doing The Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female, right? Like
bangers.
What was going on in this like era, Becky? Like why was everyone so particularly scared of women, it feels like, right? But at this kind of era, late 80s, kind of early 90s here.
I think it was a point in culture when you sort of get to the end of the 80s and women are going through this, in air quotes, like wanting to have it all.
Yes.
Sort of
How
period.
dare they, frankly.
How dare they? Honestly, get back in the fucking kitchen where you belong. And it was also around the point, especially with the kind of more erotic thrillers, the AIDS crisis was in full swing. And so sex was scary. Women were scary because we had the audacity, Mike, to be asking for more freedoms, more respect,
for enjoying sex.
Ew!
Like, God's
How
sake.
dare we? And I think that there was really a cultural feeling of resentment and fear towards strong women who were sexually active, sexually aggressive, women who, as I say, wanted it all, wanted to have a career and a family and enjoy sex, have their own money, their own means. Really, we can come on to talk about it when we talk about Fatal Attraction, but certainly in 1987, there were like kind of surveys being done amongst women who were, where the respondents were coming back and they were sort of saying, we're pushing men for more respect and more freedoms. And men were becoming really defensive about it,
really
like
threatened.
Yeah, really threatened. And women were, all of a sudden, we were asking for divorces and we were having affairs and we were daring to, want our own careers and sort of move up the ladder in the hierarchy of business. We may have been shifting. I say we, I was 5 at the time, but I'm talking about women collectively.
Yes.
As a 5-year-old, I was just really fucking precocious.
Yeah, I was like, what were you up to at this point?
I was on the board and,
you had your shoulder pads.
Right. You better believe it. But, women were sort of shifting their priorities from the home, from being homemakers to wanting careers, shifting priorities more to our friends and to our children rather than just the men in our lives. And it's documented that men were feeling really threatened and defensive about that. And I think that there was a deep-seated resentment and fear around gender roles and sexuality. Men were seeing feminists as sort of witches, and I think Hollywood was sort of reflecting that as 80s career women being a sort of like, in these films, they sort of become like these homicidal maniacs, these sort of vamps, and really sort of pushing this message that we were sort of wrong for wanting it all.
It's insane, isn't it? And so there was this real, genuine, deep-rooted fear of women at this time, right? That was permeating the culture. And then, of course, what was going on, Becky, in horror at this time, or in cinema generally? Because we've talked about this a little bit, but we were over the boom of the early 80s slashers, right? We'd done the slashers to death. We were in this kind of weird in-between phase. People, we've talked about it on this podcast as being a bit of a dead zone for horror. But actually, of course, it wasn't, because these were the movies we were getting. It was this weird dichotomy of we were either getting really, really cheap straight-to-video bargain bin horror movies, right? Sequels and franchises and that kind of thing. Or we were getting these high-end...
like prestige.
Kind of starry pictures, Silence of the Lambs, Misery, Fatal Attractions, all this kind of thing. And these movies were prestige-y and they were respected. But... these films were filled with kind of schlocky, slashery, gore and horror, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because they're not slashers. They don't have kind of enough of a body count.
No.
They don't have enough sort of out and out violence running through the course of the runtime.
Yeah.
But they often have one or two kind of key set pieces where those influences from like 80 slashers really show their influence.
Yeah.
And both of these films have got that.
Yeah.
So, you've got like sequences where there are kitchen knives and full like blood and horrible visceral violence on screen. But they're always sort of housed within these like thrillers. So they're called thrillers. And I know, there's an argument. We spoke about this when we talked about Silence of the Lambs. There's this idea that at the time they were more prestigious. They were getting Oscar nominated and, various awards. And this idea that the label of horror was too sort of base for the films that, were sort of being lumped in with that at the time. And so the word thriller being used was a way for them to be kind of acceptable, I guess, acceptable for the Academy, acceptable for you to tell your friends that you were going to the cinema to go and see them. Nobody was going to be embarrassed by being like bumping into their neighbor.
Yes.
Going and seeing Silence of the Lambs or Fatal Attraction or Misery. But at the same time, they are absolutely... just awash with this kind of this tension, this atmosphere, and these moments of real visceral horror.
And not so much Misery, but Fatal Attraction and this other kind of wave of erotic thrillers. A lot of explicit sex too,
Sexy.
Right? And again, like... I know there's a lot of discourse about this these days, but it's not the kind of sex that we see that often in mainstream cinema anymore, especially not with A-list stars like we were getting in these movies at the time,
Absolutely. And, with Fatal Attraction, Adrian Lyne was the absolute king of erotic thriller at this time when you're getting all these huge A-list stars like fucking on sinks into it,
exactly. So we have high-end schlocky smut, basically, beginning with this movie. Let's get into it. Let's discuss Fatal Attraction from 1987.
A look that led to an evening.
We were attracted to each other at the party. That was obvious. You're on your own for the night. That's also obvious.
A mistake he'd regret all his life.
Now, where's your wife?
Hey, honey, oh, God.
And you're here with a strange girl being a naughty boy.
I don't think having dinner with anybody's a crime.
I've got to see you.
This is gonna stop.
No, it's not gonna stop. It's gonna go on and on.
She keeps calling the apartment.
Hello?
Every time Beth answers the phone, she hangs up.
Dan Gallagher is a New York lawyer with a seemingly perfect family. 9 years married with a little girl and a Labrador and a big new house in the country. However, he embarks on a steamy weekend affair with the striking career woman Alex Forrest, who, when he tries to return to his normal life, first attempts suicide and then begins a campaign of terror when she finds out she's pregnant with his child. Unable to let him go, Alex stalks Dan and his family, eventually breaking into their dream home to boil their daughter's bunny rabbit on the Aga and attempt to kill Beth, his erstwhile loving wife. It's the classic cautionary tale / strong woman as witch movie with some hot erotic thriller vibes thrown in for good measure. Will Alex get her man, or will the American family win out by punishing the irrational 80s Uber bitch for wanting it all?
Oh, incredible. There's so much I want to ask you off the back of that plot synopsis, because you touched on so many interesting things there. But let me just start off by asking you, what do you think of this film, Becky? What's your own personal history with it, and what do you think of it generally?
Big fan.
Yes.
Love it.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of erotic thrillers. And for me, it's right up there. It's absolute quality from start to finish. We'll come on to talk about this, but it touches on so many paranoias from the culture at the time.
Yes.
And it's very sexy. You know, Glenn Close and Michael Douglas have an incredible chemistry on screen. But actually, that only takes up about 20 minutes of the film.
Yeah.
It's not like they have this long, prolonged, sexy affair. They basically have a couple of fucks, one up against a sink, and then a couple in bed that we sort of only really see the aftermath of.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of it is about Glenn Close's character just going off the deep end. And she is such fun to watch.
Yes.
She, for Glenn Close, this was a character out of type. She really aggressively went for this role. She wanted something that she wanted to play sexy. She'd never really done that before. When she started going for it, for the role, certainly Michael Douglas and Adrian Lyne really only sort of let her read as a sort of favor to her agent.
Yeah.
And then, she got in front of them and they were like,
this woman's amazing. Yeah.
Oh, it's Glenn Close.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, fine. And, we watch her go from this extremely sort of cool but edgy sort of career woman. She seems to have it all together. And throughout the course of the film, she just completely unravels. And to this day, Mike, I'm not entirely sure why, because Dan Gallagher isn't exactly, right, okay, thank you. Your face says it all. He's the most mediocre motherfucker, this guy. And I don't understand. Like, if I had one problem with this film, it would mainly be, bitch, why?
Yeah.
Just leave him. He's not worth it. But she's really she's staked it all on this weekend of steamy sex with this lawyer. And her entire world, and therefore his, just become absolutely enwrapped with this sort of obsession.
Yeah, it is. It's such a fun film. And I think it's a film that, and we'll get into this as we go, and it feels like one of those films that people have been having conversations about for the last 36 years as to, is this a good film? Is it a very progressive film, or is it actually very conservative? And there's all these kind of interesting things and topics and discourse around it, and there was problems with the ending and audience reactions and all this. But the film is just so much fun. And I think you're right in what you said, that it's it feels quality, right? Glenn Close adds an element of class to this film, even playing the nutter that she's playing. She's fucking amazing. So is Anne Archer and Michael Douglas. Michael Douglas is, for some reason, make of this what you will, brilliant at playing a absolute sleazy, mediocre sort of yuppie, right? And this is what he did in this era, from this to Wall Street to Basic Instinct and everything else he was in at the time. He was the guy, right? That for whatever reason, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because I agree with you. I'm like, what is it that women see in this man in all of these films, right? But also, he never plays like the good romantic lead. He's never like the sexy romantic lead that you actually root for. He's always also a cunt, isn't he? That's the thing. So like,
he's such a cunt in this film. Honestly, if anything, Anne Gallagher and Glenn Close should both just sack him off.
Yeah.
Actually, I think, because I know that we're going to come on to talk about the changes to the ending and stuff, but, there were drafts where they sort of teamed up against him, but very much that he was the one who has the downfall at the end, and these two women sort of extricate themselves from him.
Yes.
That is a film I would be interested to see. Because
that's the 2023 version of
that's the 2023 version.
Yeah.
100%.
Totally agree. But I think it works. I actually think that as a piece of mainstream entertainment, which it basically is, it works so well. I think the pacing's great, the performances are good, the story kind of really cranks up and moves along. Like, considering it's 2 hours, it really feels like it moves at quite a pace, I think.
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely.
And yes, we'll talk about that ending and how it was changed and how the ending is pretty silly. But as a horror fan and a slasher fan, I kind of love the ending
Big
too.
fan. Yeah.
Like it is. And I can see that people have issues with that ending. But also, I also get that is the crowd-pleasing ending, right?
It's completely hysterical. It makes not a lick of sense, really, when you start to unpick it.
No.
But what you get is Glenn Close having fully transformed into this monstrous being.
Yes.
Absolutely, the word of the day, unhinged.
Yes.
And she's this villain by the end of it who needs to be like taken down, and she is taken down, and that is what certainly as horror fans, as a horror fan, I particularly enjoy that denouement.
There's something about these movies particularly, and I feel like this even with Misery too at the end, where the last acts are so OTT, like, let's really, really not just like kill this woman, but really brutally kill this woman, right? Like, I do feel like there's something about it with these female villains. And again, this was famously had people in audiences yelling, kill the bitch, yes. Right? And there is
male audiences mainly.
Right, exactly. And there is something like, oh my God, like, they really push it, don't they, in both this and Misery, at just how brutally these female antagonists get killed compared to like most male antagonists in these sorts of films. It's interesting.
I mean, coming back to this idea of her being this sort of witch, by the end of it, she almost is a supernatural being. She's like, he strangles her, he drowns her. Yeah. She's sort of cutting herself. Mm-hmm. By the end, they have to shoot her to get her, to put her down. Yeah. Like, it is completely OTT. But I think, they reflected the test audience's reactions to the film by changing the ending, because audiences were shouting for her death. When Anne Archer's character, when the wife threatens her down the phone and says, basically, if you come near my family again, I'm going to kill you. There were cheers in the audience. It's like people wanted Glenn Close's character to be brought down, and they really do that in the most spectacular fashion.
They really do. So let me just start off by asking you, what do you think of Adrian Lyne as the director here? Like, he had done, obviously, like, he sort of single-handedly in some ways launched the kind of erotic movie into the mainstream, right? Because he had previously done 9.5 Weeks from a couple of years earlier, which was a bit of a financial flop. It actually didn't do that well, right? I think it's kind of grown over time.
I love 9.5 Weeks.
Yeah, love a bit of night. And also, FYI, Mickey Rourke a much sexier man at the time, at least, than Michael Douglas, right? And obviously Kim Basinger. I mean, obviously. But yeah, he had done 9.5 weeks. This kind of very, very obviously like erotic
and Flashdance, don't forget.
And Flashdance, very sexy musical. Let's not forget. And then of course, like he went on to do other similar things after this. But what do you think of him as a director and the job he does in this particular movie?
I think he does exactly what he needs to do. You know, he directs Douglas and Close with a real intensity. Like she, as we've, already alluded to, is by the end of the film absolutely batshit off the end of the pier. And with Douglas, he directs him to, he's such a sleazeball, but the way that he interacts with Beth and Ellen, his wife and daughter, you believe him as... I think this is one of the criticisms that's sometimes levelled at it in terms of the hysteria of the ending, is that really for a lot of the film, this is a believable story. This is a man who has a happy home life, is happily married, has this lovely little daughter, they've got their little golden lab and, they've sort of moved from this inner city apartment to this beautiful home out in the country. And he has this affair, it happens and it's believable. And I think Lion does a really amazing job actually at making it relatable for the audience. Mm-hmm. And then it does go off the deep end by the end of it, but his direction of the actors is such that you are invested in the affair, you're invested in the marriage, you're invested in the relationship between Dan and his daughter. And so when it all starts to go bonkers, it's like the stakes are there. You understand what it is that Dan is set to lose. And unfortunately, to some extent, I suppose, so much of the sympathy, I would say, actually is with Dan and his family.
Yes.
And not enough is necessarily given to Alex. Because let's face it, Dan betrays both of these women. He's the one that sleeps with her, fair enough. He's honest with her from the beginning. He's married and she has a rather extreme reaction to their tryst. But he's the one that, betrays both of these women. And this is why I think there has been quite a lot of discourse really around the ending of why is it Glenn Close's character who is being drowned and stabbed and shot and strangled?
Yes.
What is it exactly that he's losing from all this? Because at the end of it, him and Anne Archer, fine, they don't exactly drive away into the sunset. But one of the reviews at the time was something like, the couple that kills together stays together.
Right, exactly. Well, that kind of very pointed and cheesy final shot of just the family photograph, on the sideboard,
Ridiculous.
It is almost it's almost laughably kind of cheesy, that ending, isn't it? And I think that Adrian Lyne actually did want to make something a little bit more subversive and a little bit more feminist than what we got, right? And again, maybe we should just talk about this now because we keep bringing it up, but these changes happen because the studio wanted it and because the audience wanted it, right? But initially, the original ending, and people can watch this on YouTube, it's still out there, but it involved basically Glenn Close's character, Alex, killing herself, right?
Yeah, I think at the end of it, he gets arrested for the murder. She's taken her own life. He gets arrested for the murder, and Beth actually comes to his rescue. So again, not necessarily the most feminist of all endings, but it was very much more that he at least was, I guess, more at risk. Really, I mean, you're led to believe that he has all this stuff to lose, but really the tension is never so much, especially after he admits it to his wife in the version that we get to see. After he admits it to her, like, what does he do? He stays in a hotel room for a couple of nights, and then he's back in the family home after she's had a car crash. Like, the risk is never really to him. The risk is always to Alex. And I don't know, how do you feel about this idea of her being pregnant? Because it's not something that I've heard talked about so much in the discourse around the film, but is there this idea that there's a hysteria in her because she's pregnant with his child? Is she, is she meant to be like overly hormonal or what? Like,
I think, yes, I think the root of her becoming more and more quote unquote unhinged, it feels to me is due to the pregnancy, and not just kind of chemically, but I mean because I wonder if she actually wouldn't have given that much of a shit about Dan after that weekend had she not found out she was pregnant.
Right.
Like, he tells her literally to fuck off and she kicks him out of bed.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like she's kind of done with him, like a bit fuck you at that point, right? I suppose actually no, she does then try to kill herself, doesn't she? Okay, maybe not, but it does feel like when she finds out she's pregnant and the fact that she miscarried and she thinks this is her only chance to have a child, that is what really triggers this "you need to be there for me" kind of mentality that she has.
His absolute knee-jerk reaction where he thinks he's being the big hero by saying like, "Oh, look, don't worry, I'll be there for you. You won't need to pay for it yourself." Pay for what? Well, the abortion, obviously. Like, come on,
God.
dude. Read the room.
I know. It is. Again, it just comes down to this idea of it was the man, the heterosexual man, especially at the time's worst nightmare, right? It's like the nightmare scenario. And of course, this was, like you mentioned, this is kind of also tied up in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. There is this idea that like sex equals consequences, like essentially like sex equals death, sex equals an absolute nightmare for the privileged white man,
Absolutely. But I guess what's frustrating about the film that we get is that sex doesn't really equal consequences, does it?
No.
He doesn't end up with another kid that he has to pay for. He doesn't end up losing his wife and child, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And actually, again, all of the consequences are on the woman. She has dared to be sexually voracious and sexually aggressive and to know what she wants and to have this this affair, however brief it is, with this married man. Now, she enters into that transaction with her eyes open. Of course she does.
Yes.
But he does too. And really, she's the only one that kind of comes off badly from it, to the point that she is literally murdered by this couple. Like, they get to, again, not exactly sort of ride off into the sunset, but they get to carry on their lives. And this woman who dared to be sort of confident and put herself out there and to have sex that she enjoys and has a certain amount of agency in, ends up dead at the end of the film.
Yeah, exactly. Because she's kind of led. The message is almost like, well, you should have known better than to get pregnant. Right. And expect something from a married man, essentially, right?
Yeah, there's something about this idea that, especially as like a single career woman that Alex is, and with her being played by Glenn Close. So there's this whole thing, as we've already kind of spoken about, that, this wasn't a role that would have necessarily automatically gone to a woman who looks like Glenn Close.
No.
And some of the slightly less favourable reviews at the time spent far too much time sort of talking about how she looks. Yes. And, she's not a She's not a sort of traditionally beautiful, in air quotes, woman. Anne Archer is even shot throughout this film almost more sort of desirably as Glenn Close is. And this idea that somebody of Glenn Close's age, somebody the way that Glenn Close looks, who isn't this kind of uber beauty at the time, especially in 1987, sort of should almost be grateful for whatever attention that is given to her by somebody like Dan. And when she isn't grateful for the weekend stand, is sort of, I don't know, knocked down off of her pedestal.
Exactly that. So let's talk about the cast. While we're talking about Glenn Close, let's talk about Glenn Close, because what an actress, right? As well. And this was.
Is she? Yeah, she's all right.
She's pretty good, isn't she? She had done a couple of things, but this was really her sort of breakthrough, wasn't it, I think, into the mainstream in the way that this was for a lot of people. And she's gone on to have like the most amazing eclectic mix of roles that she's played since this movie, right? But what do you think of Glenn Close generally?
She's incredible. I don't think anybody could deny that Glenn Close is an exquisite actress. She does the most amazing performances. And, you know, this is tantamount to how she is so versatile. You know, it was a relatively early in her career, but already by this point, she seems to have garnered a reputation for sort of prestige and, quality performances, to the point that, as we've said, you know, this wasn't something that would have this wasn't a role that would have automatically jumped to anybody's mind for Glenn Close. And I love that she's so versatile, that she came in and blew everybody out of the water, and her chemistry with Michael Douglas was such that they couldn't cast anybody else.
So good.
And she's unbelievable in this. Her transition from her cool, very sort of almost cold, but
almost aloof, kind of the way she is at the beginning.
Exactly. Aloof is such a great word for it. This sort of career woman where she seems to have all of her faculties and, you know, everything sort of within her control. And then by the end of it, you know, she's completely transformed into this villain. It's a fantastic kind of sort of encompassment. That's not a word, is it? It encompasses so well.
Yes.
Just making up words. It's fine. All words are made up.
Why not? Exactly.
It encompasses so well, you know, her range, like within this role. I just think she's fantastic.
She goes on to play a lot of really sort of formidable, often quite scary, but powerful women, right? Like, and I think of everything from like playing like a lot of like presidents' wives or first ladies to playing like Cruella de Vil and like all these kind of things, right? But she's so good. And I think we'll talk about this with Kathy Bates too. It's just the right balance of a big performance, but never too, for me at least, never too cartoony, like, or over the top, you know?
She's still believable, even in that sort of final sequence where she seems to have become this supernatural being where she can't be killed and she's appearing out of nowhere in this house. I still believe the transformation. I still believe that she can have gone on this journey within this film where she has become so obsessed with, and in some ways she, like, obviously she's obsessed with this bloke, but it almost becomes that she's actually obsessed with the situation. She's obsessed with the fact that he's got this family, you know, we'll come on to talk about the rabbit, obviously.
We will.
But this idea that this little bunny rabbit sort of symbolizes this perfect family to her as she's sort of watching through the window as they're playing in the sort of candlelight with this new little pet. Like, it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
But because Glenn Close is so good, I believe it at every step.
She's everything that the traditional housewife isn't, right? She puts careers first. Whenever when pets get brought up, she makes a joke. She's like, I'm a great cook. I'm good with animals, right? Like, she's very, I don't know, quote unquote, undomesticated, I suppose, right? Like, even her home, and we should talk about this because obviously it's important to this kind of subgenre that we're talking about. The way in which they choose, the way in which the Gallagher home is portrayed, like you've just mentioned, compared to her like trendy downtown rundown apartment block, right? Like, it's so interesting, isn't it? It looks like you're stepping into like an evil lair when he arrives at her apartment block, and there's like steam and there's like it's great, isn't it? But I love the way that all of that is kind of portrayed in this.
Oh my God, it's amazing. Like with the sort of elevator going up, and it's all so industrial.
Yeah,
and
industrial. Exactly.
It's absolutely perfect. And it's important to the film that at the beginning, so we talk about Dan Gallagher being this sort of mediocre guy, and he is like, fine, he's a successful lawyer, but that even if it's not explicit, it is implicit that he is nervous about buying this new home. He's obviously not making the sort of bank that means that he can just buy this house and never think about it again. Like, it's a money pit, right? It's a fixer-upper.
Yeah.
And even with her, there's never any question that he's got enough money that he could just like pay her off, for example.
Exactly.
The money side of things really plays into it. And that, she's almost got him over a barrel because he is not in the position that he can just extricate himself financially.
Totally.
Fine.
And he's worried about losing, I think he's worried about his money too, in the whole worried about losing his wife and kids.
Of course he
I think
is.
he's worried about giving half his money away too.
Of course he is. It's like, it's so generous of him to offer to pay for the abortion.
Yeah.
Like, buddy, no, that's not how it works. So, her home and the home that he is in at the beginning, that sort of little apartment where he's like, he has to sort of have his headphones on so that he can, like, it's not like he's got a home office, right? No. He has to have his headphones on so that he can kind of drown out the family noise so that he can do his big important job. And then that move to the big house, all of a sudden, it's like, he's sort of taken this step up, and she is this huge threat to that.
Yes. Every time the phone rings and he's like,
oh my God, the phone.
Good. So good. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's it. I think that Dan Gallagher is supposed to be a kind of everyman, isn't he? He's supposed to be a man that probably 90% of the male target audience at the time were able to in some way relate to. Like, he's not uber powerful and rich, but he's just a kind of like successful working family man.
Exactly.
And other than that, not a hell of a lot to him, to be honest. Right, but what do you think of Michael Douglas just generally? Like, again, like, such a big deal around this time. Sort of, this was the same year that he won an Oscar for Wall Street as well, and then obviously went on to do so much through the 90s.
I'm a fan of Michael Douglas on the whole, I think, especially during this era. I get the impression that sort of privately, he's a bit of a dick. But in terms of his...
Some of the stuff he said in interviews.
Some of the stuff he said in interviews. Mike, my God. But anyway, as a star, I get why he's so bankable. I really do. Like, he's very good at playing these men who almost have a certain amount of power, but there's always somebody more powerful than him sort of going on within the story. And he's so good at playing that kind of reaction. He's always this dick swinging, ideas above his station kind of guy. And there's something about Michael Douglas, like he's handsome, but he's not that handsome.
Yeah, he's everyman handsome, right? He's not like Brad Pitt handsome. Right. It's a different kind of level.
Exactly. Yeah. And he'll sort of unbutton an extra button on his shirt, or he'll wear
a V-neck jumper.
Oh, the V-necks. And he embodies that kind of, I think for male audiences, he's relatable and just like then some. Do you know what I mean? Like he's
charismatic.
He's charismatic, he's aspirational, but he's still everyman enough that the guys in the audience they can relate to him, and they can relate to, especially in this film, Dan's story. This is a time in 1987 where women are starting to demand a certain amount of power themselves after men having all of this power for so long. They are the ones who are out there having the affairs. And women are like, all right, well, I'd quite like some of that too, please. And all of a sudden men are like, oh no, wait, what? No, that's not how, no, that's not how this works. We have the affairs. We ask for divorces.
Yeah. Wait a minute.
Wait a minute. What do you mean that, you're doing this? And I think that Michael Douglas was very much zeitgeist for that.
He was. So funny as well that obviously Michael Douglas he's a Nepo baby, as we'd call him now. His dad was Kirk Douglas, right? And interesting that he had already won an Oscar for producing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
That's insane, isn't it? I kind of didn't realise that. But as an actor, at least, this was right on the cusp of his peak, wasn't it, really? He has said some outrageous things in interviews. It does almost feel like he is a bit like some of his characters that he's played, because he's constantly, apparently, on the record talked about how he's got a massive dick, boasts about his penis size. He, at one point in 2013 in an interview, because he got mouth cancer, right? And he blamed it on too much cunnilingus, that he'd given his wife too much oral sex, and that must have been what gave him mouth cancer. It's like, wow.
Unbelievable. I mean, wow. Although
he's like
to
a
be
teenage
honest,
boy, isn't he?
I'd love to hear from Catherine Zeta-Jones whether she deemed it as too much cunnilingus or not.
Yeah, exactly. How much is too much, Michael? Yeah. I wonder. Very funny, very interesting guy by all accounts. But
and constantly on the record for absolutely not being a feminist.
Oh, so funny. Yeah, really was I don't understand all this. It's just aggressive towards men and all this. What on earth? Yeah. So interesting. But he's also gone on to do some really funny, interesting stuff. Did you watch the Liberace Behind the Candelabra film?
I haven't seen it.
See, that kind of made me change my mind about him a little bit, because he plays such a different against type kind of character in that as well, which I kind of loved. But yeah, he's an interesting actor, but undeniable that he is good in these movies, and that his chemistry with Glenn Close is excellent.
It's phenomenal. So Again, coming back to it being believable, that first scene when they're at the bar together at the party, there's something so subtle there between them. They're not even really flirting. But then when they meet again, and then, they try to get the taxi and they go for a drink and stuff, even though it's such an escalation in terms of their relationship, there's something between them on screen that you get it. You get why, they might end up, I was going to say in bed together, but I should probably say on a sink together.
Well, should we talk about the sex in this?
Can we?
Becky's at last. The sex, again, this was kind of right at the beginning of this kind of really interesting erotic thriller era, where it was just adults having and enjoying sex in mainstream cinema, which is crazy how unusual that is, right? And I do actually think Adrian Lyne is really good at doing this kind of stuff, because there is something kind of almost, again, it almost verges into being ridiculous, but it doesn't quite, I think. And I think that's because of the actors and the way that the scene is handled. But all of that, lifting her up on the sink, splashing water all over her, is amazing, right? And then also that moment of like him carrying her to bed, but they're kind of stumbling and they're laughing together. And I think Adrian Lyne spoke about that scene, and he said you kind of need to add that in. He said people will laugh at sex scenes anyway, even with the best of intentions. They can come out funny unintentionally. So if you make it so that the characters are finding it funny, it can kind of help that, and it can become therefore hotter, essentially, which works, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, this idea that you have to give the audience something to laugh at, or otherwise they'll laugh at you.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, Mike, sex is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, it's really like dumb and laughable. And, you know, I love that scene so much where he sort of picked her up and he's got his trousers around his ankles and he's stumbling around and they're both laughing.
Yeah.
Like, that is how people really have sex.
Yes.
Like, I love it when you're sort of, I don't know, you fumble a little bit, or you're kind of like falling over each other, or like something happens and you're like, you sort of laugh. Like, that is sexier than sort of, I don't know, pretending that it's this big serious thing. Like, sex is funny, and it should be, and is often sexier for that.
I think that's so true, because so much in films, sex is treated as so stylized, and you don't see those moments when they have to suddenly take their socks off, or like or stop to put a condom on, or whatever it might be. Like, all of those other little stages of when you have sex aren't shown in a film with beautiful lighting and everything else, you know. And
100%. And with this film, when it's made, you know, we've talked a little bit about the AIDS crisis, and you know, after this, really sort of in the early 90s, sex suddenly becomes very, very serious again. And for good reason, of course it does. But it has a weird sort of outcome, I guess, in movies, in that it doesn't really become serious around safe sex. It's not like all of a sudden people in films are talking explicitly about we should have safe sex because of the AIDS epidemic. It just has this
becomes
symptom.
a morality thing, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that's something that I find really interesting.
It's so true. And I think there's also something to it that it's not, they're not, well, how old are they supposed to be? Maybe mid-30s, 40, like early 40s?
She's 36.
Yeah.
Because she says that she's 36 because apparently her womb's about to dry up.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah. So there you go. So I think that's the other nice thing about it, is that you're watching two, as she says to him, two consenting, discreet adults have quite realistic, although also quite stylized and erotic sex, right? But I think it strikes the really perfect balance in that regard.
I agree.
And I think that their weekend they have, you understand how it happens, I guess, right? Like, you can see that there is this chemistry between them. They have some amazing sex, then they go out dancing, and it's like, I
love that. I love when she's like, are you feeling energetic? And he's like, his look on his face, he's like, why? What have you got in
mind?
Yeah, exactly. And it's fine. They just go and do like salsa or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But then there's the bit like where, you know, she sort of convinced his wife's going to come home later than they were expecting, and she sort of convinces him to spend the day with her. And they're sort of out walking his dog, and you know, they're walking through the park, or they're sort of walking through the streets with their arms around each other and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, again, like, you can see how this has happened.
Yeah.
And again, for me, it A, makes it all the more sexy, and B, makes it all the more believable when she has this reaction, really, to him then being like, well, no, sorry, tough luck. You know, I've got this life.
Well, the other thing initially, apparently in the original script, he was much more sort of forthcoming. Like, he was the one making the first move with her a lot more than her. And in the newer version, it's much more her being like, come on, stay over another day, come and do this, come and do that. You know, like, we're both adults, we can do this. And he just, you know, like, just had to go along with it, didn't have a choice kind of thing, which is kind of interesting, right? Like, kind of take that complicity away from him a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it works really, really well. And she's set up at the beginning almost like what Gillian Flynn would call the cool girl, right? Like, she's very much like, she's a cool professional. She's like very much like, no pressure, no responsibility. We'll just do this and it will be fine. And then, of course, it all changes very, very quickly. So yeah. It's great. And then, of course, we get the horror. And, like, let's talk a bit about the horror.
Okay.
I suppose, and there are these kind of quite, like, disturbing moments. Like, the first moment when you're like, uh-oh, is when she slits her wrists, right? That's
God.
a pretty disturbing, upsetting moment. And things just kind of escalate from there, right? But what do you think of this movie as a horror film and the way Adrian Lyne kind of directs the horror in this?
I think it's solid, actually. The bit that there are a couple of bits that really stand out. One of them is when she's like, it's so ridiculous, but it works, is when he's basically said, no, I don't want to go to the opera with you. And so instead, she spends her evening listening to Madame Butterfly crying and just turning her lamp on and off.
Yeah.
That is when, as an audience member, you go, oh, she has lost it.
One of my favourite Family Guy sketches is where's Meg? And then it's just a fast cut to her just sitting in her room listening to Madame Butterfly and turning a light on and off. It's so good.
Talking of Family Guy, I know we're going to come on to Misery, but have you seen the Misery spoof?
Oh, I'm your number one fan. I'm your number one fan.
I'm your number one fan. I'm your number one fan. I'm your number one fan.
But yeah, I think the horror in it is good, actually. Again, I believe that she is capable of escalating events to where she does, you know, the constant phone ringing is just, it becomes so jarring.
That is like a slashery when a stranger calls, kind of stalkery kind of setup, isn't it? The constant phone ringing and the menace and the dread every time you hear the phone ring. There's
so much tension. And Adrian Lyne is very good at undercutting that and playing in on it. So sometimes it will be her and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it will be, you know, his mother-in-law, or it will be his secretary or something like that. And therefore, you know, it lets all the air out of it and like, okay, fine, it's not her. And then the phone rings again and it's like, oh my God, will it be her this time?
Yeah.
The phone will ring at home and the little girl will pick it up, but it's all right. It's him calling from the hotel room or whatever. That is really, really well played. You get an absolutely like quintessential mirror scare later when Beth clears the mirror and Alex is there in the background. There's a couple of sort of like minor jump scares when he's listening to the tape and Beth comes in and makes him jump. I think it's good. Like the tension, the tension and the sort of escalating stakes and escalating fear really work effectively for me. So yeah, I'm into it.
And, you know, so often in mainstream horror, the rule is you don't hurt the children and you don't hurt the pets. And this movie absolutely crosses the line at a very, very disturbing moment, which is kind of the thing that this film is most famous for, right? Which is the bunny boiling. Right. And that scene is really interesting because that is handled in very much like a schlocky horror way.
Oh
like,
my God.
The way cuts. Adrian Lyne, the cuts, it almost feels like something out of Don't Look Now, that moment. Like the montagey cuts of like one character running across the garden and the little girl screaming and the hutch as the lid comes off the pot and we see the dead rabbit in there. As a bunny owner, Becky, it was a very, very triggering moment.
I've been following very closely, obviously, your content of not watching the film with the bunnies in the room, them being very cross,
very upset about the whole thing.
Yes, understandably.
It is, because that bunny's adorable as well. Absolutely adorable.
I know, and he's so little. And when he's first got him, like in the office, and he's sort of petting, like. Why did it have to be a rabbit?
And there's something, again, kind of quite silly about it, isn't there? Right? But like putting a bunny in a boiling pot, it's like, it's so over the top, but it kind of works, you know?
Daddy!
What?
He's gone! Dad!
And it's the first proper home invasion. I mean, the whole film in some ways has been this kind of metaphorical home invasion.
Right.
Of this,
yes, absolutely.
This woman coming in to disrupt this family's home life, right? But of course, this is when actually the boundary is breached. Like the you know, she is really sneaking in and killing the animals.
I mean, imagine coming home again, you know, sort of talking about you come home and you know that somebody's been in your space and fucking with your stuff. Just come home, you know. Everybody knows when they leave their house, even subconsciously, the state that you have left your house in. You know, you know, where stuff is, or the state that certainly, you know, your pots and pans are in, whether they're in the cupboard or whether it's literally boiling on the stove. Yeah. And to come home on your own and to find...
It's horrific.
A big pot just boiling on your hob.
And the little girl is adorable, by the way, as well. The daughter is absolutely adorable. And there's that really over the top bunny boiling scene, and then there's like a hard cut to just her in bed looking a bit teary eyed, right?
Just crying and sort of whimpering. I know.
So sweet. Hell. And then of course we get the final act. So as we mentioned earlier, like there was this original final act where she kind of killed herself and he got arrested. And it was sort of like she died, but was she going to get the final win almost? Test audiences hated this ending, and apparently it got really kind of bad feedback. And there was this feeling of like you mentioned, every time that audiences saw that moment when Anne Archer's character threatened to kill Glenn Close, there was this massive cheer.
Yeah.
This is Beth Gallagher. If you ever come near my family again, I'll kill you. You understand?
And the producers suddenly started to realise, I think the audience want to see Anne Archer kill Glenn Close, right? And so they went back and just reshot the whole ending. Adrienne Lyne initially wasn't into it. Glenn Close was very not into it. She refused initially, right?
Actively against it. Yeah. She, you know, she's said to have sort of asserted that, you know, she'd worked so hard on creating Alex as somebody with like a sympathetic mental illness.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, let's face it, that's what she has. Yeah. Like she's mentally unwell in this film. Of course she is. And yeah, so she railed against it. And apparently the way that she sort of positioned it in her own mind to come around to be convinced to reshoot this ending was that she kind of thought of it as a Greek tragedy and it being cathartic for the audience and stuff.
Which it certainly is cathartic for the audience. I mean, this is the ending that audiences absolutely loved, which is that their family are at home, they think everything's fine, back to normal, the wife's running a bath upstairs, and then all of a sudden we get that bathroom mirror jump scare, right? Glenn Close, Alex has found her way into the house, and she comes and sort of attacks the wife in this kind of hysterical state. She's carrying a knife, she's sort of slicing into her own leg, which is horrible, isn't it?
Fucking hell.
Meanwhile, the water starts leaking through from the bath, and so Michael Douglas notices it downstairs and he comes up.
Michael Douglas notices it. Of course, Dan being fucking useless as usual, and the dog notices it first.
Yeah, it's so true. And then, of course, you get this big fight, this showdown in the bath. It's very slashery, it's very psycho. You know, it's like in the bath, the strangling, the struggle, the stabbing, all of this stuff. Like you said, you think
her coming back to
she
life.
Comes back from the dead for a jump scare. Like, it's ridiculous. And it ends with the wife killing her with a gun that have we ever seen them with a gun in that house?
This film is like the opposite of Chekhov's gun.
There is no gun up until
there's no gun.
So
there's
funny.
no hint that, like, you know, there's nothing like she's been out with her parents and, you know, they talk about her living on a farm and knowing how to shoot stuff or anything. It's just like all of a sudden,
bang, she shoots her exactly.
One shot.
That's it, gone. And then, like, it's so funny that, you know, you get the kind of the moment with the police and the paramedics, and all you see is just one cop just shake Michael Douglas's hand and walk off. It's like, what? They've not even been brought in for questioning that this married couple strangled and shot a woman. No.
And drowned.
No, and
Strangled,
drowned.
shot and drowned a woman.
And by the way, it's really visceral, that shot of her face under the water as she's being strangled and is drowning, right? And her eyes kind of puff out of her head and everything.
Oh my God.
It's horrible, isn't it? So
again, Glenn Close's performance is just like, she obviously really, really fucking went for it. I have so much respect.
And there is almost this overt, well, this is how I choose to read it, and I don't think this is probably planned, but there is this kind of almost, it's so ridiculous that it hammers this kind of message home of just how ridiculous and sad this situation is, that the family then just live happily ever after, having killed this very mentally unwell woman, as they just like walk back into their living room to sit down on the sofa, and the camera just pans across to this little framed photograph of the family on the mantelpiece, and there's this like sweet music plays as we cut to credits, and it's like, what the hell?
Yeah,
that was the ending that audiences absolutely ate up at the time, right? And the film was like a massive hit. So funny, so interesting. And it did, I mean, like, it stayed in the top 10, in the box office top 10 for months. It cost $14 million to make, and it made over $320 million.
Well, to the point that this is the film that like launched that kind of autumn blockbuster.
Yes, the kind of autumn movie for grown-ups kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly. That then stays in the charts over Christmas into the new year. Sort of gives studios money over that usually quite barren period. And puts movies up for Oscar nominations. This is the film that sort of did that.
Yeah. This is it. This is the reason why we have movies like Tar, thanks to Fatal Attraction, basically.
Thanks, Fatal Attraction.
So there you go. It's one of those films that's like really kind of crossed over into, I feel like, beyond just horror fans or film fans. Everyone knows this, don't they? Everyone knows the term bunny boiler. Like, bunny it's boiler, really kind of like become such a cultural touchstone, hasn't it?
Which is its own problematic fave.
Right. Well, exactly. Well, maybe that's where we should finish by, let me ask you that ultimate question about this film. The tricky question to answer, right? Is this film some sort of feminist progressive masterpiece? Is it actually quite a conservative film that it's all about maintaining family values and, sex is bad? What do you think? Where do you land on it?
Honestly, I think sort of neither, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a feminist movie that particularly sympathises with Glenn Close's character. But at the same time, I don't think it really sympathises with Dan either. I don't think, certainly even now coming away from it, I don't come away thinking that the film wants us to sympathise with Dan. I think he's a shitbag, and I think it knows that he's a shitbag.
Yeah.
I think that it sympathises with Beth. I think that it sympathises with Ellen. But I think that it could and maybe should sympathise more than it does with Alex.
Yeah, completely agree with you. And I think it's very possible to be aware of all of that stuff and still really enjoy the film, right? The film is still very, very fun as like a schlocky genre film, basically,
I love this film. Exactly. I love it. Again, like, I watched it earlier this year. So, on Letterboxd, if you go into your stats, it will show you like films that you've watched more than once. This came up on that because I've already watched it just for fun once this year. Like, I love Fatal Attraction, and it was an absolute fucking delight to do it for this.
And actually, I think a lot of people have been rewatching it this last year or so, because if people haven't checked it out, definitely worth checking out, right? Karina Longworth's You Must Remember This podcast, in which she's talked in depth about Fatal Attraction and the whole kind of erotic cinema of the 80s and 90s, which is like so full of great sort of historical facts and tidbits.
Honestly, what a series. I mean, her podcast is second to none anyway.
Unbelievable.
So this, so she did Fatal Attraction in her erotic 80s series, and she's just literally finished the first part of her erotic 90s. She's taking a summer hiatus and then she'll be back, but she's just done her Showgirls episode. Big fan.
Unbelievable. Well, there you go. Well, that is Fatal Attraction from 1987. Hello, everybody. Before we get into the second half of this week's episode, just a quick announcement to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Carl Richter. Carl sent me a lovely message, which I'm going to read right now. He says, "Hello, Mike. I'm very happy to be able to support a podcast from which I've learned so much and gotten so much enjoyment. EOH has not only made me a more knowledgeable horror fan, but also a more sophisticated film lover generally. I'd like to point listeners to On the Line, the podcast I produce and host for the Texarkana Gazette, where I work as art and entertainment editor. It's mostly of local interest, but EOH listeners may be interested in my Halloween 2021 episode. I interviewed Pamela Pierce Barcelow, the daughter of independent filmmaker Charles B. Pierce, who wrote and directed cult horror classics The Town That Dreaded Sundown and The Legend of Boggy Creek. Both were set and produced in and around Texarkana. Thank you, Mike and crew, for such a fun, fascinating show and for bringing together the community of fans I so enjoy interacting with." Oh, thank you for that lovely message, Carl. And one more time, I will mention his podcast there. That's On the Line. And if you listen to the Halloween 2021 episode, there's a really nice interview there with the daughter of Charles B. Pierce, the director of The Town That Dreaded Sundown. That's very, very cool. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Carl Richter. And if you want to join him and become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little dedicated segment on a future episode just like this one, where you can send me a message to be read out, you can plug any of your own work, your own podcast, whatever it might be, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $20 per month level. If you sign up at that level, you will also get a whole back catalogue of bonus episodes to listen to, and you will get treated to a new episode every single week. It's basically like having an entire second Evolution of Horror podcast of content to listen to. So, what are you waiting for? Sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's move on to the second discussion of this week's episode, one of my absolute personal favourites. It's time to discuss Rob Reiner's incredible Misery from 1990.
You did it! You did it! You did it! You did it! You murdered my Misery!
Eddie!
I thought you were good, Paul. But you're not good. You're just another lying old dirty birdie. And I don't think I better be around you for a while.
And don't even think about anybody coming for you. Not the doctors, not your agent, not your family. Because I never called them. Nobody knows you're here. And you better hope nothing happens to me. Because if I die, you die.
Annie Wilkes is an ex-nurse who just loves to read her favourite writer Paul Sheldon's trashy novels. One day, Annie saves Paul from a near-fatal car crash and takes him home to restore him to health. But her noble intentions soon show themselves for what they really are, a fanatical form of captivity. When she reads his new book, where Paul has killed off her favourite character, Misery, Annie loses all semblance of the caring nurse she's been playing and forces him to write a new novel, bringing her heroine back to life. As the local police investigate Paul's disappearance, Annie will do anything to keep him in her home, including some extreme tactics involving her sledgehammer. The film is a masterclass in tension and ends in a violent showdown with an invalided Paul fighting for his life against his biggest fan.
Yes! Becky, this film is perfection as far as I'm concerned. This is a 5-star, no-note film for me. But what do you think of Misery?
Yeah, pretty fucking close. I absolutely adore it. This is one of the films that was featured pretty early on in my horror career. I saw this very young, and it was that perfect mix of melodrama and horrific horror that just got me. And I knew from seeing this that I was going to be horror's biggest fan. You know, I was in. This was it.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I saw this young. This is one of those movies, like The Silence of the Lambs, these films in this early 90s era, which for some reason my parents deigned fine for me to watch when I was young, because they were classy films with classy actors in them. And they would let me watch something like Misery over watching something like an 80s slasher movie.
Oh yeah, 100%.
They got that completely the wrong way round, because no 80s slasher movie has ever scared me. This movie scared the shit out of me when I first watched it. I thought it was one of the most traumatic things I'd ever seen, but I loved it as well. Absolutely loved it.
It's up there with so that sequence when Paul gets out of the room in his wheelchair and mate. And she's at the shops getting the paper, and he knocks off the penguin and he catches the penguin and he puts the penguin back wrong. That is up there for me with that sequence that we discussed with Silence of the Lambs, where she is down there in the basement in the dark with the night vision goggles. It's exactly the same experience where I was wrapped and also didn't know how my life was going to continue after this all ended. I was just like, I don't know how I come back from this. I've never been so fucking terrified in my entire life.
Yeah, I have never been so scared. There's that idea of being abducted, none of your family or loved ones knowing where you are, that you are physically mutilated so that you can't get away, and you're stuck with seemingly no way out. It was just, I found it one of the scariest things I'd ever sat through as a kid. You know, it's like a child's worst nightmare, let alone an adult's, isn't it? It's like, it's horrific. The
portrayal of pain in this film.
Oh, like, my God.
I've been through some pain in my life. I've had various surgeries. I know what it's like to not be able to move because you are completely incapacitated in agony, and you are waiting. The moment you take some painkillers, you are waiting for the next moment that you can take some painkillers, because you just know that. And right, so Stephen King's novel, Misery, is actually the only Stephen King book I've ever read.
Oh, wow. It's a good book.
It's a really good book.
Yeah.
Also, absolutely fucking terrifying.
Horrible.
And in the book, the hobbling, she actually like cuts his feet off rather than breaks his ankles with a sledgehammer and cauterizes them.
It's horrible. Yeah.
And there are these descriptions in the book of the pain in his legs being like waves or tides coming in to the shore. And as the tide goes out and the like wooden things from like the pier or the jetty or something like that, it's been a while since I've read it, as they become exposed, that is how his pain sort of becomes exposed. And perfect. That is an image that, like you say, is perfect. That has stayed with me. And this film encompasses that so perfectly. James Caan's performance of when the pain is taking him over and he's due some of that, those little red pills. It's remarkable. The pain in this film for me is something that just is the most horrific, like one of the most horrific things that I've ever seen. Yeah,
you're so right about that, because there are very few, I talked about this when I talked about Martyrs, because there are very few horror movies that actually focus on pain. There are plenty that have death and slashings and stabbings and beheadings, but movies that actually focus in on pain are some of the most upsetting ones to watch. This movie is genius because it is very upsetting and it is about pain, and yet somehow it's also quite funny as well, and we'll get to that, right? But yeah, I agree with you. The way in which Rob Reiner and these actors and Stephen King's writing put across what Paul Sheldon is really going through in this is horrific. Yeah,
absolutely.
So yeah.
I was talking with my very good friend Helen over the weekend. She was staying with us, and she is somebody who I admire greatly because she isn't a natural horror fan, but she's a huge film fan, and so sort of forces herself to watch these horror films. It's not something that she naturally gravitates towards and is absolutely terrified by them. But she'll sort of she'll put herself through it because somebody will recommend something to her, or she's like, no, I think I'm a big enough girl now that I should watch X, Y, or Z. We were talking about this over the weekend when she was staying with me, and she hates blood in real life. She was talking about how she is a first aider and she used to work in kitchens and stuff, and used to have this thing where she would be very, very hyper vigilant over people carrying knives and things in the kitchen, because if anybody started bleeding, she'd be on the fucking floor, which was no good to her because she was the first aider. And I was like, I don't really have any problem with blood. But it's pain for me. So somebody could be bleeding out in front of me and I wouldn't feel the slightest twinge of sort of feeling icky. But the moment somebody winces because they've got a stomachache or something, I will be unconscious.
Well, yeah. And this is the really interesting thing about the changing the sawing off of the feet for the hobbling, because they did it partly because of censorship and because they thought this is more likely to get a mainstream audience, and if we get rid of that, that really, it's going to be a lot gorier, obviously, to watch her sawing off some feet. But what they replaced it with is, I think, possibly worse. There's something about seeing, I feel like I talked about this with Dan Martin recently about, it's more about the injuries that you can relate to that are more powerful, right? And I would say the majority of us probably don't know what it feels like to have a limb sawn off. Right?
No,
but
I'd hope not.
But I think there is something we can relate to about that, what it feels like probably to have a block of wood put between your ankles and then to have that mallet come down, because it's like a very extreme version of stubbing your toe or knocking your kneecap on something hard or whatever, and it's genius really, because they did it as a way to kind of get around the censors, but it ends up being, I think, even more horrific on film than what it could have been,
That moment, I know that we've jumped straight to the hobbling scene, but but just that glimpse that you get of his foot bending, and you only see the one, and you only see it for probably less than a second. Yeah. And that is all you need to know exactly what he's going through. And James Caan's reaction is just mortifying.
Phenomenal. I want to talk about the performances in a minute, but let's just start by talking about Rob Reiner and the way in which he directs this film, because Rob Reiner may be one of the best directors that's ever lived.
Ridiculous, right? Nobody fucking I say nobody talks about him. Loads of people talk about him, but it's weird that he, it's like Scorsese, Spielberg, De Palma, where the fuck is Rob Reiner in all of these discussions? His filmography is
unbelievable.
And
we talk about famous streaks of movies from directors, right? And people talk about Carpenter, Cronenberg, of course. Excuse me. This is Spinal Tap, The Sure Thing, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men.
Yep.
What? He just bashed. That was
one film later, the greatest film that's ever been made, The American President. Thank you very much. 90s masterpiece, no notes.
Yeah, exactly. But he is unbelievable, Rob Reiner, and I think the reason people don't talk about him as much is because you can't put his work in a box.
Yes.
There is something about, we love to talk about directors as auteurs, right? And this is I'm constantly sticking up for Wes Craven for this same reason, because people say, oh, Wes Craven's filmography is a bit messy. What is a Wes Craven film? And I'm like, but that's kind of what I think makes him brilliant, because he changes up his style and he does such different things. And I think, rather than be like a Wes Anderson or whatever, he is doing something that doesn't make every single one of his films look the same. Rob Reiner isn't making his films about him. He's just telling really good stories, I think, right? And Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and Misery, wildly different genres, styles, everything, but all perfect movies, right? It's unbelievable.
Perfect movies.
Yeah.
What a guy.
What a guy. What a guy. What a hero. I know he's not had any as much since then. You know, he was really in the 80s.
I don't care.
But
I don't
you've done
care.
that
Like,
streak, you know.
exactly. Fucking retire. Put your feet up, buddy.
Unbelievable. So good. And like his direction, I don't know how much there is to say about it or how much you think there is to say about it, because it's not showy, right? Like,
no.
He lets the actors act. He lets the story tell itself, basically, it feels like.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I think for me, the things that really stand out to me are his characterization of Annie, the way that the camera lingers on her so close up at points, and then when you think it couldn't get more close up, it gets more close up just to really fucking show you exactly what she is up to and what she means and what she intends. And the tension, like those sequences, those cuts between him sort of wheeling his way around the house and her coming back to the house, or the sequence when Buster, the cop, is looking around the house when she's let him in, looking for Paul. Like, these are, again, I mean, I've said it, but masterclasses, absolute masterclasses in tension.
And we mentioned Stand By Me there, another incredible Stephen King adaptation as well. And I had this conversation with Jamie Graham about who is the best at adapting Stephen King, right? And obviously there's people like Frank Darabont who has done a lot, and these days Mike Flanagan has done a lot of successful Stephen King adaptations. But again, Rob Reiner, there seems to be something about the marriage of Rob Reiner with this material where it just seems to work, right? Because there's a lot of bad Stephen King adaptations out there, but his Misery and Stand By Me have got to always be in the conversation, right, for two of the best ever Stephen King adaptations as well.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Stand By Me is, and again, we come back to this word quality. Like, these are two just, you could sit your parents down and watch either of these films and, like, no shade on anyone's parents, but, you not today.
They're just more discerning than us parents.
They are just more discerning, like us, creeps. But I mean, you're absolutely right. These two have got to be up there in the conversation. Probably for me. Oh God, I don't know. There are so many. I think Misery is top 5 for me.
Absolutely. Oh, it's maybe top 3 for me. I love it so much. And this had come off the back of quite a string of Stephen King adaptations for the small screen, the big screen. Not all of them that great. Like they were starting to veer into kind of like very trashy territory. After we had that amazing wave in the 70s and early 80s of like Carrie and The Shining and Christine, we'd started to get into the era at this point of like Maximum Overdrive and The Running Man and some of the TV miniseries and even Pet Cemetery, which I know we love, Becky, obviously, but wasn't particularly financially or critically successful.
I was really, really worried that you were about to start disparaging Thinner then, or Needful Things, and I'd have been so cross.
Thinner! I love Thinner. But again,
I love Thinner
not the most popular of adaptations, let's be honest. So yeah, I think like this really kind of... And then I think, what was it, a couple of years later, we had Shawshank, but this really kind of put that quality back into Stephen King adaptations, I think.
Yes,
right?
100%.
Well. And the other thing I think is amazing about his direction, and this probably comes down to the performances as well, which we'll get into next, is the kind of tonal balance of this film.
Oh.
There are very, very, very few films, I think, that are both horrific and hilarious at the same time. Like maybe this is mainly Kathy Bates and her performance, but there are moments when I am chilled to the bone by her, but I'm also laughing out loud at her, like it's incredible the way that it balances all the tones in this film.
It's amazing. Like the bit when Misery the pig comes in.
And she's like...
Honestly,
so
where she's like oinking at him, it's like something out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yes, it is.
But at the same time is like so absurd and hilarious. Her performance, it like Should have been Oscar winning.
I mean,
I'm joking.
Okay, right. I was like, it is, right? I think this is one of, again, maybe in my top 10, if not 5, all-time favourite film performances. Like Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes. I love Annie Wilkes so much. I'd go live with her in her little farmhouse. I think she's brilliant. The character of Annie is so... Again, how is it that they managed to get that balance? Because she's so cartoony at times. Like,
I know.
You say oinking like a pig and running around, and she goes really over the top and she's cock-a-doodie and all that stuff, but it works.
The bit when he's writing Misery's Return and she reads the bit where she's come back to life and she's like... pirouetting on the spot, like, she's alive, and then she goes, I'm gonna go and put on my Liberace records.
Yeah, I love it so much. And when she's driving and you cock-a-doodie and all this, like, God. It's so stupid, but somehow I can believe that woman exists. Like, I believe there are probably real people out there that live in the middle of nowhere that are like that. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think a lot of them at you on Twitter, actually, Mike, don't they?
Yeah, there are a few out there, that's for sure. Yeah, and actually, that's another really interesting thing about Annie Wilkes, right, is that the more I watch it these days, the more I'm like, wow, this is kind of ahead of its time in that she's the ultimate kind of toxic fan, right, as well. She's like, you did something to my character that I don't like. I am going to physically disable you and make you rewrite it.
Yeah.
It's like all those people that wanted to cancel The Last Jedi from the Star Wars canon. It's like these fans that feel like they own a property and an author. You know, it's so interesting.
What really scares me is that those people, the Last Jedi people and their equivalents over various franchises, will look at this like a fucking playbook.
Yes, exactly.
They'll be like, yes, that is entirely rational behaviour that I would like to undertake, please.
Well, and there's something about her that taps into all of us, right? There's the good fandom and there's the bad fandom in there because, yes, she is a vicious, violent, controlling, toxic person that wants her favourite art to be exactly as she wants it, right? But there's also this other side to her that is like, don't fuck me around, don't cut corners, keep it consistent, make sure you do the character justice. And there's that incredible famous monologue she gives about watching the Saturday serials when she was young and how they kind of copped out on a cliffhanger by kind of retconning. And we've all been in that position, right? We've all been those types of fans that will get really annoyed that one Halloween movie kind of retcons the previous one or whatever. So, you know, I think Annie Wilkes as a character kind of really encompasses all kinds, both good and bad, of fandom.
The bad guy stuck him in a car on a mountain road, knocked him out and welded the door shut and tore out the brakes and started him to his death. And he woke up and tried to steer and tried to get out, but the car went off a cliff before he could escape. And it crashed and burned, and I was so upset and excited. And the next week, you better believe I was first in line. And they always start with the end of the last week. And there was Rocket Man trying to get out. And here comes the cliff. And just before the car went off the cliff, he jumped free. And all the kids cheered. But I didn't cheer. I stood right up and started shouting, "This isn't what happened last week! Have you all got amnesia? They just cheated us! This isn't fair! He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car!"
I mean, you'll come on to talk about this with things like Single White Female and Hand That Rocks the Cradle. But Karina Longworth in her podcast, when she talks about the kind of children of Fatal Attraction. So Fatal Attraction is this idea of the one night stand from hell. And so many films that came out in its wake are things like Misery, The Fan from Hell, The Hand That Rots the Cradle, The Babysitter from Hell, the Single White Female, The Flatmate from Hell. Yes. And that is exactly what this kind of rash of films becomes. It's just like, pick a thing, make it from hell, make a film from it.
Annie Wilkes is sort of the original incel troll, right?
Dude, if she had read it, nobody would have a fucking chance.
100%. It's so interesting. And yet, again, like, I think that's what it is, right? It's like, it's such a big, larger than life character, and yet there's something so real about Annie Wilkes, you know? She's just amazing, isn't she? And Kathy Bates, I mean, what is there to say? What an actress, right? Unbelievable.
What is there to say? She, and again, with these close-ups that Rob Reiner puts on her face, she's got nowhere to hide as an actress. No. Like every twitch, every line, every smirk or you know, anything on her face is absolutely there. Any wrinkle of her nose, anything is just there for you to see, and she is flawless.
Do you think that the film, how do I put this? Do you think that the film in any way uses the way, like we talked about how Glenn Close was kind of like in some ways not your conventionally beautiful leading woman. Is the film ever making fun of Kathy Bates' physicality or the way she looks in this film, do you think?
That's such a great question. Honestly, I think no. I don't think that it is. There's one incredible line. Wait a second, I wrote it down. She says something like, "You'll never know the fear of losing someone like you if you're someone like me."
God, it's and so sad that
is absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And so I think that the film acknowledges the type of person that Annie is. And I think that her physicality plays into that. But I don't think at any point it is making fun of the way she looks.
No, agreed. I think it's saying that she lives in a world where she's going to be treated like an outsider, right? Like an other. And that has kind of given her even more so that feeling of being this outsider, this weirdo in this house in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And also the fact that she does look... She looks strong. She looks physically strong.
Right.
And that's the other
This
thing.
is one of the things that is most terrifying about her. When we first see her, she is carrying Paul Sheldon, James Caan, who is not a diminutive man.
No, very much not.
Over, like fucking fireman's carrying him on her shoulder, like through the snow.
Unbelievable.
If there's any shot that is going to set this character up as physically imposing and somebody that you should fear, it's that.
And she's the way that Rob Reiner chooses to frame her, like there's a lot of moments when the camera will go like into her face from down below, and she'll look big, almost like in the way that it reminds me of, like, actually you've not seen Matilda, have you? But it's almost like the way that the Trunchbull is framed in Matilda as well. It's like this big imposing villain, and it kind of works in that regard, I think, you know. And yes, she's physically strong, and like you said, James Caan, he's not a slight man, right? We talked about Lady in a Cage earlier this series, but you see very much how big and imposing James Caan is for the majority of his career. So it's so cool to see him play this role as well. And actually, let's talk about James Caan, because obviously everyone talks about Kathy Bates and how brilliant she is in this, but he is unbelievable as well, right? Because all he can do is lie down still and react. Like, in some ways he has the harder job, and yet unbelievable, right? Magnetic.
Absolutely magnetic. Again, you know, talking about believability, his react, as you say, all he can do is react, but his reactions are so good that doesn't matter. He'll have these just moments where something will just pass across his face, that when when Annie gets first cross about him swearing in his new book, or the character swearing in his new book, you first sort of see those cracks. Yeah, that flip, those cracks start to appear. And he understands the vulnerable position that he is in. And you just see all of that just play across his face in a moment, in a shadow. It's remarkable the way that he can convey to the audience that he knows that, holy shit, this bitch is mental. Yes. But also, like, he can't let her know that he is thinking that. And so he's so still. Like, that is
unbelievable. Unbelievable acting. And the two of them, again, it's a different kind of chemistry to Fatal Attraction.
It is a different kind of chemistry.
What a chemistry, right? Like, I can't take my eyes off the two of them. I mean, and the film really does completely, it's basically a two-hander in one room, this film, right? And it completely rests on the two of them. It's like a play almost. And it's just perfection, isn't it? They're so good.
So good.
Yeah, I love, like you say, I love those moments of like, he's panicking, he knows he's in danger, but he's trying to play it cool, but we can see all of that happening on his face at once, right?
Yeah.
And also, he never does the stupid thing. Like, he's always got these plans, and he knows what to say to her, and he knows how to manipulate her, and he knows when he needs to charm her and, like, get on her good side and all that kind of thing. And it's just that she happens to also be really smart and keeps discovering his plans over and over again, right? But, you know, James Caan keeps making these smart decisions. He's like, he's going to use the hairpin to open the door, and he's collecting all of the pills because he's going to drug her, and it feels like every plan that goes into action fails, right? And then of course we get that whole B plot where the police sheriff is like looking for them and he's going to come save them, and that all amounts to nothing. Right? Poor Buster. Buster's a very sweet, that's a very sweet little like side plot, isn't it?
Mike,
Buster and his
fact
wife.
that Virginia has just lost her adorable husband and is going to go on the rest of her life without him is the biggest tragedy of this film. I am not okay with the fact that Buster gets off.
I know.
At all. It is so cruel. They set up so beautifully this lovely relationship between the police chief and his deputy / wife, and her putting her hand on his knee while they're driving along.
I know.
Like,
she'd rather be curled up in bed with the sheriff.
Virginia, when you're in this car, you're not my wife, you're my deputy.
Well, this deputy'd rather be home under the covers with the sheriff.
She's just horny and wants to be at home with her husband.
Who can blame her? He's a sexy man. Yeah. It's outrageous. I can't believe it.
It's so brutal, isn't it, that whole plot strand amounts to nothing when he's just shot and that's it. It's like, oh my God. But that's it. She knows she's one step ahead of him. Like that whole thing about she spots that her penguin is facing the wrong way and everything. It's like that.
Should be heading due south.
Oh my God. And you just know it, don't you? Like I remember even as a kid noticing that moment when he knocks the penguin and puts it back wrong.
What, that he put... Like, dude, honestly, you're so careful about everything. Like, you go, like, his amazing reflexive reaction to catch the little guy. Oh, my God. I had for a little while on Twitter as my header photo, the penguin facing in the right direction, because it was such a monumentally terrifying image.
So good, isn't it? And you mentioned this at the beginning of our chat about the film, but like the tension of those sequences is what makes this film just so masterful and brilliant, isn't it? It's just wonderful.
It's unbelievable. Like proper white knuckle, edge of your seat kind of, and especially again the way that Reiner intercuts what's going on in the house with where she is in relation, and oh my God, it's just, like I say, edge of your seat.
And then finally we get that really violent final act, that final showdown between the two of them, which is again like no holds barred, right? When he's like putting his thumbs into her eyes and smashing her head against things, and I love that it ends with her head hitting the typewriter and it's like ding. Like it's so good. Again, it's kind of really funny but brutal, isn't it, that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like you said, that he manages to negotiate that balance so perfectly between the most violent, brutal moments and the comedy, the humor behind them. You know, there is something funny and ridiculous about her ending up with him in her house.
Yes. Absolutely.
And the movie plays with that so beautifully.
Yeah, it absolutely does. You're right. And there is something about her. You know, again, a bit like with Alex Forrest in Fatal Attraction, there is this like heft to the performance that doesn't just make her two-dimensional. Like, this is a very sad, like you mentioned, very sad, like mentally unwell woman, right? Those moments when she has her little like low points, you know, when she's like staring out the window and everything, and it's like,
when it's raining.
God, it's sad, and it's also very scary because you're like, oh God, she really is going to do something very dangerous at any given moment, right? But it is like, it's played to perfection, I think, all that stuff, you know?
It's played to perfection. And don't forget, like, Reiner plays so perfectly this idea that she is this sort of sad, lonely spinster in a sad, lonely house with her pig and her chickens. And, you know, she's obsessed with this novel character. But also, you know, let's not forget that when Sheldon finds her sort of memory book or whatever the fuck it is, and is going through it, and it would appear that she has kept clippings from every murder she's ever fucking committed, which looks to be her husband, for starters, and her medical school roommate, and a bunch of newborn babies.
She's a baby murderer.
She's a baby murderer. Yeah. So let's not have too much sympathy. It's not just like she's a scary old spinster who's, you know, sitting home alone reading her misery books and then happens to find Paul Sheldon incapacitated in her lap. Like, this definitely feels engineered from, you know, I know that she doesn't cause the crash. I know that it's the blizzard. But even the fact that she was like hot on his tail, it's like she is an absolutely terrifying character.
She's a monster. Yeah, she's a monster.
She's a monster.
And
she seems to be capable of anything.
And it's the classic, you know, you find yourself in the monster's house, right? This house is like, goes all the way back to movies like The Old Dark House that we did at the beginning of this season, like this idea of like this lair almost, right? This place. Yeah. The house itself is really interesting too, because it's like, it's not, I guess it goes back to that theme that we've discussed a lot this season, which is like, how well do you know people, like your neighbors or whoever, these people that seem normal, but you have no idea what's going on behind their closed doors in their houses, right? And that's what this woman is to a T. Like, she's not like Leatherface that appears outwardly monstrous. She looks like a normal, friendly woman.
But is actually an absolute sweetheart.
Yeah, exactly, which is, poor, he's just misunderstood. Whereas this woman, seems sort of fairly innocent until you get to know her a little bit, basically, and have a snoop around her house.
That's, exactly. And even when, like, for the audience, like, I think it's worth talking about the music in this film because the score does so much to create that unease and feeling of tension around her. Like, there are these swells of like horror strings and things when especially there's sort of moments when she like drives past Buster in Virginia.
So
and
good.
The camera just sort of swoops round and then it's like dun dun dun, essentially. Like, but when you first when the camera first sort of reveals that Paul is in the house, you know, this very sort of twee and comfortable little room. You know, there's nothing outwardly that makes it look like a prison, but that's exactly what it is. He has found himself within these four walls that turn out to be literally a nightmare.
You're right. And the first moment, we're about 30 minutes into the film, right, where Annie Wilkes reveals her true colours when she walks into his room in the middle of the night and she's furious with him about Misery being dead, her favourite character being dead, right? And that's the first moment in the film when the lighting is kind of dark and shadowy. It suddenly looks like a haunted house with a kind of pale spotlight on her face. She's standing in the doorway like a monster. The score suddenly sounds like a horror score. There's this almost jump scare, right? When Paul looks up and he sees her standing in the doorway and this chord, this boom.
You dirty bird. How could you? She can't be dead. Misery Chastain cannot be dead.
Annie, in 1871, women often died in childbirth.
But her spirit is the important thing, and Misery's spirit is still alive.
I don't want her dead! I want her! And you murdered her!
Oh, absolutely chilling. Right, we are going to have to wrap up on Misery fairly soon. But first of all, let's head on over to this week's Wild About Horror, because, of course, psychoanalytic cinephile Mary Wild has plenty of thoughts on Rob Reiner's Misery.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Rob Reiner's psychological thriller film, Misery, based on Stephen King's novel of the same name. The story centers on an obsessive fan who holds a world-famous author captive, forcing him to rewrite her favorite book. Novelist Paul Sheldon is the man behind the best-selling series of Victorian romance novels featuring a character named Misery Chastain. He grows weary of the Misery franchise and reaches a point in his career where he feels called to pursue material that is more artistically rewarding to him, finishing a manuscript that he hopes will launch his post-Misery era. While traveling from Silver Creek, Colorado to New York City, Paul is caught in a blizzard and his car goes off the road. A nurse named Annie Wilkes finds Paul and brings him to her remote home. Paul regains consciousness and finds himself bedridden with broken legs and a dislocated shoulder. Annie claims to be his #1 fan and talks at length about him and his novels. Out of gratitude, Paul lets Annie read his new manuscript. To his surprise, she angrily criticizes the profanity in his new work, and then becomes enraged when she purchases his latest novel at a local store and discovers that her beloved Misery dies at the end of it. Annie forces Paul to burn the only copy of his unpublished manuscript and orders him to begin writing a new book titled Misery's Return, in which the character is brought back to life. It's a special brand of cruelty, forcing a writer to destroy their own work and redirect their calling. Annie insists that her beloved idol return to his former style, pompously commanding him to, quote, "Rid the world of this filth. Light the match. Can't you see it's what God wants? You were put on this earth to help people, Paul. Please, help me help you." End quote. The patronizing way in which she says this is maddening to me. Where the hell does she get the nerve to talk like this? But thinking about it more deeply, maybe it's possible that all of this is happening on an interior front. That is to say, the entire premise of the film might be situated in the psyche of the artist, and the monster, Annie Wilkes, is really an externalization of Paul's anxiety crisis, in which he imagines an extreme form of rejection from his devoted fans when they encounter the radical shift taking place in his work, from frivolous romance novels to gritty urban tales. I once saw someone on Twitter say that Annie Wilkes is emblematic of the modern cultural landscape, in which morally indignant, self-appointed arbiters of righteousness demand that creators abide by the audience's specific set of values. Annie, as the so-called superfan, feels entitled to the labor of the writer she claims to admire. She is compelled to encroach on the autonomy of the artist. Paul's very survival and physical well-being are contingent on Annie's arbitrary opinion on his work, which apparently supersedes his creative prerogative. This is rightly shown in the film as evil. There are protracted scenes of Paul cooped up, cloistered inside this house. No one knows where he is. He is drugged and given supplies to write. There's a lot of pressure on him to revive the Misery franchise, which he had intentionally brought to a close. Misery is a very apt film title and general existential signifier for what Paul has to endure. being forced to repeat an aspect of his work he had long outgrown simply to please this insufferable Karen figure is a very infuriating type of torment. During the dinner in which Paul tries to spike Annie's wine with crushed painkillers, he makes a toast saying, quote, "To misery and to Annie Wilkes who brought her back to life," end quote. This reveals the paradoxical nature of having an obsessive fan base. These worshipful lovers of the popular book want the title character, Misery, to live eternally, but their refusal to let her go becomes a source of great pain for Paul, rendering him literally miserable. He's told that his livelihood, his very life force, is inextricably linked to the return of an artifact he had already relinquished. Is there a more obscene brand of misery than to be forced to participate in the zombification of your own work? Annie requests that Paul use her as an inspiration while he writes in captivity. But she's actually strong-arming him into telling precisely the story she desires, policing his every word, and reacting in a controlling manner at the sight of anything she dislikes. How terribly ghoulish that the end product should reflect the desire of the consumer and not the artist. Earlier in the film, she ominously tells Paul, quote, "You better hope nothing happens to me, because if I die, you die," end quote. This thinly veiled threat might reveal the secret nature of the writer's anxiety that if he disappoints his readership, he'll lose the successful life he has built for himself. Paul must negotiate conflicting pressures and expectations on his work. It is a morbid thought that he must keep his followers happy, otherwise they'll destroy him metaphorically. Misery masterfully showcases the harrowing experiential reality of creating a work of art which requires many sacrifices and a willingness to suffer. Paul is stuck inside Annie's house, strapped to a bed, tortured, physically abused, verbally berated. This could be his own internal process of anguish on the creative journey. It is an insular experience and very isolating. He's unreachable when he's in this zone. To sit down and write is represented here as a terrorizing and violent event. The movie opens with Lauren Bacall playing Paul's literary agent, and she makes certain demands on him. She's the polite, glamorous public face of Annie Wilkes. The agent's expectations on the writer to continue churning out chart-topping romance novels eat away at him. The high gloss and sophistication fall away. His stylish New York City agent with film star looks turns into a murderous village weirdo, the dreadful creature, Annie Wilkes. It's interesting to think about the topography of a person completely on their own in a room working and the psychological implications of that. In the film, there's also a Hitchcockian element of looming danger, with Paul setting little tasks for himself to escape his situation despite the possibility of being caught. When Annie shoots the police officer, it can be read as a symbol of the psychotic state because it's a literal disavowal of the law, a rejection of the thing that binds the symbolic order together, here represented by the local sheriff. Annie has really lost the plot. She's completely delusional. This implies that the creative process is a risky business, but the artist has to negotiate the psychotic condition and fully embody the world they're conjuring up for the sake of their work. This can be compared to the process of suspension of disbelief. The artist has to surrender and inhabit the imagined world, occupy it as long as they need to. In this sense, Annie's psychosis unlocks a state of imagination and creativity that operates outside the boundaries of what is permitted by law and order. A positive resolution to the hellish incident is confirmed at the end of the film when Paul is shown safe and sound back in New York after surviving the ordeal in Silver Creek, Colorado. Feeling happy about the publication of his new book, which marks the start of a fresh writing era, he tells his agent, quote, "In some way, Annie Wilkes, the whole experience, helped me," end quote. For this reason, Misery is a wonderful case study of how important it is to hold the line when it comes to the representation of trauma and working through difficult feelings. There are so many pressures nowadays to sanitize art and hide away tricky aspects of life, censoring the parts that are regarded as problematic. This film shows us just what we stand to gain by sticking with the hard stuff and processing it all to achieve something artistically meaningful and essentially beautiful. Until next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wilde, who I know right now is very, very busy working hard on her first book. So, Mary, I hope you're having a much better time of it than Paul Sheldon. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary's takes on genre movies and more, then sign up to her Patreon. Just head on over to patreon.com/Mary Wilde. Becky, we should wrap up on Misery. My final question to you about this movie, how do you think it holds up? You know, like, I think what's really interesting, we talked about Fatal Attraction of feeling so much of its time, right? But I feel like there's something about Misery that feels a little bit more timeless in comparison.
I would agree. Yeah, I think it's absolutely timeless. I don't think you need to be, what is it, 1990?
Yep.
I don't think you need to be watching it in 1990 for this to be effective, you know. I mean, especially as you said around stuff about toxic fandom, if anything, it's more relevant now than ever.
God, it really, it's I think it's aged incredibly well. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Nothing about it kind of, because we're in this like weird little house that's in like a world and time of its own, it doesn't really feel like, you know, attached to any time and place, apart from maybe when we see Lauren Bacall, the agent in the office.
We haven't even talked about Lauren Bacall.
Yeah, she's the only character that feels a bit more like we're back in the early 90s, late 80s, doesn't she? But yeah, exactly. Yeah, we do get a few little glimpses of some other people and places every now and then.
I feel like it could almost be that Fatal Attraction and Misery were within the same universe.
Yeah.
That, Alex and Lauren Bacall's character sort of work for the same publication agency.
Exactly. Oh my God, I would love that. I'd love that if these all parts
Let's have
of the same
that crossover.
universe.
I'd love for Annie and Alex to take their revenge on some dirty birds.
Oh, they could live together and keep each other company, I reckon, those two. Except one of them really wants a baby, the other one really doesn't like babies, I think. So that could be an issue. But
they could both just look after Misery the pig together and be happy.
Have a lovely time. Well, there you go. Well, thank you so much, Becky, for joining me.
Mate, thank you for having me. What a joy.
What a pair of movies. These wonderful, mad, misunderstood women in these films, you know. Love them both. And my final question for you, Becky, what is your favourite home invasion movie?
Oh, God. Well, it's difficult because...
You can play fast and loose with home invasion like I do, by the way, if you want.
Thank you. That's very kind. I mean, if we're looking at films that you've done, then probably my favourite is Sunset Boulevard, which is
perfect film.
Like a perfect film.
Yeah.
Literally perfection.
Nothing isn't perfect about that film. Yeah.
But I guess if we're talking more loose, or like not more loosely, more specifically, like home invasion.
Yeah.
Do you know what? It might be The Strangers. Oof. Like, I really, really like it. Really like it. I've come to it later. But for me, I wonder if the reason is that I avoided home invasion for a while because I was scared of what it was. And for me, The Strangers perfectly embodies what home invasion can be.
Yeah.
Or certainly what I thought it was.
Yeah, that's
in
the movie
my head.
That's the movie that is the subgenre. Like when people think of home invasion, they think of The Strangers, I think, right? Those masks, what happens to those characters, the bleakness and the nastiness of it almost, you know?
Because you were home, you know, this whole idea, like the nihilism and the it's just so bleak. And I think it was a film that I was so afraid of for so long. And then I watched it and I was like, holy shit, this is fucking incredible for one thing. And also just as scary as I wanted it to be and just really embodied everything. But also like, I love Last House on the Left.
Oh my God, yeah. I need to lend you my Blu-ray of Angst, by the way, because I think you'll love Angst.
Yes, please.
It's going to be very much up your street as well.
Yes, please. Yeah, well, now that I have gotten over my own squeamishness and have now, like...
You've opened these doors, yeah.
neck deep in all of this fucking, like, fucked up stuff, then, yeah, I mean, it turns out that this stuff is very much my jam. Who knew?
There you go. Love it. Well, Becky, thank you. As always, like, it's just been the best time. So thank you so much for this. And just remind people where they can find you and more of your stuff out there online.
You can find me across social medias at Becky Darke is the best place.
Amazing. Becky, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to the wonderful Becky Darke. So I had so much fun discussing those two movies. I would love to hear what you guys thought of our discussion and what you think of these two films. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, millions of socials now, actually, because I've also signed on to Blue Sky and I can also be found on Threads. It's very confusing, everything that's going on with social media right now. But anyway, most platforms, search for The Evolution of Horror. You'll probably be able to find us. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can also join the Evolution of Horror Discord or the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. If you want to be treated to regular bonus episodes on a weekly basis, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. And if you want to come along to any of our upcoming events, whether that be a podcasting masterclass, whether that's a screening event, a live panel discussion, keep an eye on our events page, evolutionofhorror.com/events. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, onwards to next week then. It's another very exciting 90s double bill, and we are going to continue talking about this interesting little wave of domestic set thrillers of this era. Next week, I'm going to be joined by the Faculty of Horror's very own Alex West, and we are going to be talking about Sleeping with the Enemy from 1991 and Fear from 1996. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on The Evolution of Horror.